My guest today is Dave Sparkman of Spark Your Culture. Dave, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be here, Gary.
Dave and I go way back, maybe even further back than either of us care to admit, but we were college buddies. We started our career together in public accounting in Atlanta. Dave's a year ahead of me, but then Dave's had an interesting career, not only as a partner at the firm Arthur Andersen, but also as the chief culture officer at United Health Group. So he brings a really interesting perspective to my target audience. He understands public accounting in our profession, having lived it and been a partner there, but then also working in the culture area at a Fortune 5 company. Dave will enlighten us on some things through his experience that I think will be beneficial to all of us. The topic of culture is all around us. We hear it a lot, and we just through this conversation just might maybe bring a little more definition to it, a little more clarity to it. But we won't have enough time to overstress the importance of it. So culture clearly is important. So Dave, most people think of corporate culture as kind of a soft attribute. And I think you would say it's more than just a soft attribute. How would you define culture, and why is it so important to organizations to really understand and rally around the important topic of culture?
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. There are many, many definitions of culture. The one that I happen to like is a pattern of behaviors that tend to predict future performance. The way we chose to more zero in on it at United Health Group was we defined it as the character of the organization. That is the distinctive qualities that make us as an organization different than others. So if you were to think of your favorite car brand or your favorite airline brand or your favorite restaurant, each one of them has a little different flavor, distinctive qualities to it. And I believe that every organization has that opportunity if they choose to focus on it.
So when you use the term behaviors, Dave, I mean, you and I grew up in fairly strict homes. So when we think of behavior, we think of mom and dad, more particularly probably dad cracking the proverbial ruler over our knuckles, or even worse for that matter. But when you talk about behavior, and you use that word specifically, give us some examples, or maybe just clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is what makes culture, to me, so difficult for organizations to get after, because it's far more than policies or procedures, or it becomes practices, true repeatable behaviors that you can't necessarily control. So the most famous incident of recent years, United Airlines with one of their attendants dragging a customer off the plane. I'm sure they didn't have a policy saying thou shalt not drag a customer off the plane, but somewhere that came through. And if we were to contrast that to Southwest Airlines, people couldn't even imagine that that would happen given the cultures of those two different organizations. So if we were to go through, for example, and think about Netflix versus Blockbuster. Oh, wait, no one knows who Blockbuster is anymore.
Right.
Those behaviors, they all had access to the same information about what was coming down the pike from a technology perspective, but one flourished, the other basically went away. And I believe that's because it greatly affects the innovation and the opportunity to listen and entertain new ideas. That is a cultural element within every organization.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So to pick up on that a little bit and go to the two organizations that you were primarily with in your career, you and I together at Arthur Andersen experienced some of the best culture that was ever out there as it relates to the public accounting profession. I certainly felt that in my time there, and I know you did for your extended time there. And then United Health Group, where they more intentionally made culture something that was talked about and that was on everyone's tongues, and people dedicated times and individuals like yourself leading that corporate effort. When you look at that, what do you see as the common links in those two organizations to where culture became such a driving force?
You hit on one of the words, Gary, and that's intentionality. I mean, the very first word that comes to mind is they were intentional. So, of course, I didn't have a chance to interview Arthur Andersen himself,
right?
But what at least evolved by the time you and I got to the firm were a huge list, if we were to write them all down, of very intentional aspects, many of which translated into behaviors within the firm. So, for example, a very simple one is every new hire went to St. Charles, Illinois for training. And literally, there was no negotiation about a person not going to St. Charles, literally from any office in the world. So that was a very intentional aspect. United Health Group didn't have that particular attribute of a calming training center, but leadership there made a very intentional decision to focus on transforming the culture because they didn't like the way the culture was. So intentionality is number one. Number two, I'd say they invested heavily in it. It was not a cheap endeavor. Now, as a percentage of revenues or net income, insignificant compared to a lot of other investments that go on, but it's still an investment. And then the third was both organizations chose to anchor their culture on core organizational corporate values, if you will. And those were written in stone. Those were not used as a club, if you will, but as an invitation that I believe channeled the diversity of those companies into a very productive outcome. And that's something that I think a lot of organizations miss as an opportunity, is to say, look, we do have very diverse organizations, and that's a wonderful thing, but we need to get some common ground. And core values, going to that aspect of character, that's what can make you distinct from every other organization. And not by the mere word, because let's pick on integrity or innovation. Those are words that are used quite a bit as core values, but how you define it and how you choose to implement it or practice it becomes that distinction.
Dave, when you link the first comments that you had earlier around behaviors to, let's just talk about Arthur Andersen for a second. You were there literally turning the lights off in Los Angeles as Andersen imploded. What's required to make sure that that incredible culture and that focus on behaviors doesn't get violated and disrupt an organization? We've seen tremendous disruption. How do you make sure that whatever you develop stays at the forefront and is monitored, and it's not only implemented but monitored for the long run?
Yeah, culture is a daily habit, just like our behaviors, just like brushing your teeth, flossing your teeth. I mean, and you have to do it yourself. You don't outsource someone flossing your teeth for you. No. You need to care and nurture your corporate culture, and every individual, especially the leaders, have a very direct influence on that. I had an opportunity to speak to one of the most senior leaders within Arthur Andersen a number of years after the firm imploded. And this individual believed that he could have changed the course. He revisited the core values, and he went through and described what he saw as the evolution, everything from Andersen Consulting becoming who they have become, right, into the audit partners and tax partners holding on to what they had in spawning what became now Accenture. So there were a number of intersections where he felt he could have brought a focus back to the core values instead of just having them on the list, and really making them come back alive, particularly for the newer partners, so that they would understand the beauty and the synergies of what had been built over decades in that case.
Yeah, and what an interesting perspective from his part. Yeah, I just recall, and I know you the same. I mean, the focus on technical excellence was there. The focus on integrity was there. The focus on business development was there. This incredible culture of just people, and all the focus and all the wonderful events we have. So, as I watch from a distance, since I was no longer part of the organization, and see it unfold, I would think that's not the organization that I knew. What happened. So interesting perspective. You just used the term intersection that I really enjoy using a lot when I talk about culture and performance. So maybe we can transition there a little bit.
Sure.
As you know, a lot of the folks who are probably watching this, at least in my contact world, are in the profession of public accounting, and you've been a CPA in your life, so you understand we tend to be focused on numbers and KPIs and bottom line performance and net income per equity partner. All that's very important stuff to us. Sometimes there's not a clear understanding of the linkage between culture and high performance culture and bottom line or return on investment. You've shared with me at United Health Group, there was a clear linkage and an obvious linkage from performance to culture. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and how performance and still being focused on being a high-performing organization doesn't negate the opportunity we have to have a culture that's fantastic?
Yeah, I think the thought I'd love people to take away from this aspect of the conversation is it doesn't negate, it enhances the performance. United Health Group, before we started the culture transformation journey, was already very profitable and very productive and high performing. I think we had exceeded expectations for like 40 quarters in a row of earnings estimates. But what our CEO saw was that we weren't hitting our potential. He thought there was something more there that we could be doing. So he took a very long-term view of performance, which is very difficult in today's world when everything functions by quarter. And then he chose to make an investment. He became intentional, made the investment, anchored on core values as previously mentioned, and started to go after it. He realized that, yes, you do need to measure what you treasure, to use a familiar phrase, but another phrase that we introduced is all that matters can't be measured. How do you measure energy, spirit, unity, clarity, alignment, all these things that we talk about? Very, very difficult to measure. Just like, getting back to the definition of culture, those individual behaviors of literally, at the time that I left United, 300,000 people around the world.
Wow.
You can't quantify that every day, right? Yeah. He was also very clear that our KPIs that had worked for us for those 40 quarters were not going to be changed. They were going to be enhanced. So he made it very clear that if we thought this was a soft, fuzzy little aspect, nope, we better grab onto this, because he believed it was about our potential in making us exceed those KPIs that we already had in place. So it was very clear that we were not straying from staying a high performance organization. And to me, an analogy, Gary, that I've used over years is similar to change management. In my background within both companies, focused quite a bit on change management, and you could never prove an ROI on change management. And I've talked to thought leaders over the years. It's impossible to do an ROI calculation. However, I can show you train wreck after train wreck where those principles of good change management were not incorporated into a significant change, either from a project, a program, or an organizational change. And it's a mess. So you place your bets. And what I would submit to the listeners is it's a small bet to place, very difficult. Okay, it's simple, but it's not easy, because you have to stay the course, you have to persevere, and then you will hit crises within your organization that will cause you to wonder if you should stray from what you've already set forth. And if you stay the course, you'll see the payoff.
Yeah, Dave, I read something the other day. I think I'm going to be close enough to statistics on this, but it said that approximately 2/3 of executives believe it was important for companies to have a strong understanding of culture. But it was interesting, only 24% of them also believe that the organization was good at that. And so when drilled down as to why, it was all around ROI. And this view of how do you measure ROI on quote unquote soft things. I think you've used the term bunnies and unicorns before when we've talked, but when an executive looks at that, they want something quicker. And so I like this whole idea of you stay focused, figuring out different ways of measuring things. Hey, Dave, and maybe the last minute that we have together, given your experience over 30 plus years in the business with two fantastic organizations, so what are some lessons learned that you think our listeners would really benefit from as it relates to this whole topic?
Yeah, two come to mind immediately, Gary. One is that the business needs to own culture. A function or the various functions can help significantly, but culture needs to be as central to the business owning it as their business models. You don't delegate that out to a function. You need to own it. Number two lesson that we learned is if you think you have your act together, you really don't. In a quick story, our CEO, a couple years into our culture journey, did a global town hall. And in that global town hall, he was asked the question, what keeps him awake at night? What is it that he's concerned about? And without, missing a beat, he said the primary thing that keeps him up at night is arrogance of our organization. If we actually think we know better than the consumer, than the customer, than our clients, then, okay, that's the trap that he wanted to avoid. That was his, immediate answer. And that's so true with culture. Yeah. If we think it's somebody else's job, if we think that, oh, if only George wasn't here, that would improve our culture. If you think you have your act together, you really don't. That aspect came through again and again, both for me personally. I had to take some deep breaths and gulps many times of things that I needed to change in my own behavior as I tried to lead through the change. But it was true for everyone within our organization.
Well, Dave, you and I could talk about this important subject for a long time, and I've appreciated the opportunity not only today in recording this, but in our other opportunities to talk about, to really understand more about culture, how it impacts an organization, and the critical importance to it. So, Dave Sparkman, Sparker Culture, I really appreciate your time today. I know that the people watching this will benefit from your experience and hope to get to know you better. So, thank you, and I look forward to our next session together.
Appreciate the time, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you.